All right, so we're going to talk about Ionic today. This is going to be real fun for the 10% of people who have used Ionic before to see the evolution of where we've come from and what we're doing today. For everyone else who has never used Ionic before, you get to learn like a new little mini tool that could probably help you out in your day-to-day development. If you do have any questions or want to get in touch afterwards, Twitter is probably the best place. Hartington, I normally respond because I have nothing better to do. So for the 90% of people who don't know what Ionic is, Ionic is a library of components, animations, gestures, basically a UI kit for building mobile apps. If you are using something like Angular, you can add these components into your app, and boom, you have a hybrid app. You can deploy it to native iOS, native Android. You can deploy it to the web as a progressive web app, or even to the desktop with things like Electron. The big selling point here is that instead of you having to create your entire app's UI and all the interactions and wire up all the complex animations yourself with a few components and just dropping in our library, you get all that for free. Kind of in the historical context, Ionic itself had long been tied to only Angular. We originally, when we first started building it in like 2013, we had goals to support all the modern frameworks and no frameworks at the given time. For example, we were going to support Backbone, because I was a huge Backbone fan. We were going to support Ember. We were going to support Knockout.js. Am I bringing up any fond memories or bad memories of old libraries? jQuery Mobile? Okay, good. So yeah, the entire goal was we wanted to write our components that way they could exist in all of these different frameworks and all these different tools. But we didn't want to rewrite our entire library. Once you kind of go all in on the Angular mindset of here's my directive at the time, and here's my component, here's how that works, you have a pretty good setup, and then having to rewrite that for every single framework didn't really make sense. So we had gone on from Ionic 1 with AngularJS, Ionic 2 and 3 with Angular, and right around the time we were starting to plan our next major release, we thought to ourselves, okay, can we actually do this today? And it turns out we could. We rewrote our entire component library as web components. So web components, just for people who don't know, basically a standardized way to say, hey, I have this custom tag. I have a custom functionality in the form of a class. When you render this component, here's all of its available attributes, properties, and methods, and use that for the implementation, and essentially extend a built-in div. Within 6 months of us planning our 4.0, we completely rewrote all of Ionic's core components as web components. So that way they could be used in any framework that supported web components, and more importantly, in situations where you didn't need a full framework. A lot of embedded systems these days use things like WordPress or some kind of hello.html page for people who just want to get started. Our components can work in there as well without having to need a full framework right off the bat. But what we soon found out was that these components did need a little help in certain situations. Routing basically being the one big one that is very problematic. If you've ever tried to work and integrate with a router, it's quite complicated, but we found out ways to do it and make sure that the implementation follows exactly what an Angular app would use, or whatever that framework of choice suggests. So we spent that time, we worked on our components, and we ended up shipping our 4.0, dubbed Ionic for everyone. I was quite proud because I came up with that catchline. And it was a big deal for us and for everyone else who had been following us since day one. We got to not only break free from any framework dependency, but I think follow a framework best practices at the same time. So previously to 4.0, we had a lot of custom tooling, custom routing solutions, basically re-implementing all the things that the Angular team had already provided because we had our own opinions and we were very stubborn. with 4.0 and being able to say, hey, let's not rewrite another CLI, or let's not rewrite a router, we decided to just take whatever Angular had to offer, Angular CLI, builders, Angular's router, and be able to take advantage of that and just follow what the best practices are. So that was an abridged summary of the past 4 or 5 years of our careers, or my career, especially at Ionic, and basically all the work in development history. That was like 5 minutes, so I figure about a minute a year, give or take. So if we've gone through all that work, what are some of the things that we are working on, or what are some of the things that you can do with Ionic today, and tomorrow, and 5 months from now? Coincidentally, we are also coming up onto the 1-year anniversary of Ionic 4, or we had just passed it. Actually, Ionic 4 was released January 23rd, 2018, or 2019. We're now 2020, and we are planning something big soon. But first off, what are the things that we had to work on or had to pay attention about? It's these platforms that we like to work on kind of move fast. Between that time frame, we've had 2 major versions of iOS. We had iOS 12, we have now iOS 13. Chances are, come summertime, we're going to get betas for iOS 14. And we've had 2 major versions of Android. I don't follow the Android ecosystem too much, but we've had a couple of versions of Android. But more importantly, we've had design updates to Material. So basically, their best practices for how your apps that use Material should behave, and our kind of design fell short to what these best practices were. And before I forget it, progressive web apps became super big. Like, they were already pretty important in 2019, but I think with lots of push from Google, Firefox, and some other players, progressive web apps became so important that our components need to look good not only on native, but on mobile web and large desktops. So our design had gotten stale, and we figured, well, let's take this time to basically redesign all of our components from the ground up. Basically looking at iOS and saying, hey, how does that segment actually behave? Or how do these tab buttons behave? How do animations change? What are some of the finer details inside of this interaction that people should know about? And with that in mind, we kind of said, let's not add any new features, or try not to add any new features. Software moves really fast. 6-month release schedules are really nice and really predictable. I think we're going pretty good with like a year of no major breaking changes, so you can upgrade from everything and not have to spend a day. So far with Ivy, I think we're seeing people say like a couple hours for their upgrade on the major apps. With Ionic, I hope it's like 30 minutes. And speaking of Ivy, we wanted to make sure that when Ivy came out, Ionic was basically ready to work with it. So going through figuring out what internal changes we needed to make and how we could best prepare for Ivy. So let's kind of dive in. I don't have many slides. I'm going to test fate and actually live code. And yeah, we're going to make this extra special because I use Vim. And now my editor doesn't want to work. And you have a few minutes of me just kind of babbling around trying to figure out why certain stuff is weird. No. All right. Technical difficulties are always fun. But let's go into this. Well, I have my app running. I don't want to dive into it first. We see so we get some errors. So let's dive into a project. You know what? Let's actually fix these errors first. So if we take a quick look at our project, and I'm just going to collapse things for a little bit. What we have here first is an Angular project. Nothing too fancy going on. We just have source, we have our app, some interfaces, a couple of things that we call pages. But basically, we just have a vanilla Angular project. Where we get pretty interesting is inside of this app.module component. Now, you'll see all the usual suspects, things like HTTP client, ng modules, but what we have is this Ionic module for root. So this is basically our entry point where we can add Ionic to our project and have access to all these components. One of the first components that we have to look at is this app component. Now, automatically, we're seeing we have an error inside of our inside of the setup. Basically, we have this one way of creating what we call overlays. So if you ever use any app where you get an alert, or any app that has like a little toast notification or what have you, there's a common and predictable pattern for how to do this. On previous versions of Ionic, this wasn't always the case. We had a couple of components that had their own standardized way of doing it. With V5, we kind of went back and said, hey, let's just use the standard way that we have of creating buttons or creating these overlays. So in this case, we're creating a toast, and we're just going to say, it's going to have an array of buttons. We're going to give it a role. It's going to be cancel. And text is just going to say close. So we'll let that build. Reload our page. Let dev server do its thing. Because it failed so early, we now have to go through and let the app build. Maybe if it was built using Bazel, this would be a little bit better. Cool. So we have our app running here. It's a basic example of what we call a master detail setup, where we have our side menu, and then we have this main content area. But as we start to navigate around or resize our window, we have what feels more like a typical side menu based application, where we can hit a button, get this gesture, get this menu to appear. We can also do things like swipe to close a menu, or even, I'm going to try it on desktop, swipe to open. It feels much more natural to do this on mobile than it does on a desktop. But the point is, if we're going to be on a desktop, we might as well just use the whole screen real estate. So we have our app running where we get some pretty nice animations. All of this is under the hood is using the standard kind of approach for routing. So none of this is doing anything overly complicated. We'll zoom out just to make sure it all stays on one line. But you can see we have our components. We are loading some different details, different pages and different modules lazily. So we're following the standard Angular way of doing things, which is really good. If we go back to our app, this is our look on material on desktop and on Android. So we have a very material design look and feel, right? This feels pretty good. Depending on your opinions on material, I have less than favorable opinions, but you could customize this and change this to fit however you want. We also have these pretty cool things where we have nested navigation. This is something that native gets for free, more or less, where you can have a collection of different navigation views, and then each one of them maintains their own separate history. Now, by default, Angular does not support this. You would essentially have one navigation structure throughout your entire app. With Ionic, we override and customize the Angular router to certain degrees, where in here we're basically at, let's zoom in, tabs, schedule, session, and then the session ID. Let's go to speakers. We'll go to, let's go to Donald Duck. And then if we go back to schedule, we can maintain these separate navigation structures and have our app feel more native-like. This is going to not only give us better experiences, but as we go around, these are not going to conflict with one another. I'm going to change, not my display settings, I'm going to go to General, and hey, we also have support for things like light and dark mode. So this is built in and will be part of our new starters in V5. But essentially, as you go around and have these devices and capabilities to change the system settings, you can retheme that entire app and support these different layouts. Now, let's go to something a little bit different. I know this is Safari, and people have their opinions on Safari, but I think it's actually a pretty good browser. It's like Chrome, but it's just got things in different places. So in here, we have an example of an app that's using a new component in a new kind of setup, part of our design refresh, and this is large titles. Now, what's really nice is on native, if we were to start scrolling, title would appear below the header, and as we scroll, it disappears and becomes a header. So we've gone through, and I really could probably spend the next 4 minutes just doing this because I think it's fun, but we shall continue. But basically, we have this whole entire layout separate, maintained, where the app feels native, even though it's just built with web technologies. The interactions and everything about this don't scream, I am on a web app. It all screams, I am on a app. Doesn't matter what it's built with. One thing that we do have, which I do want to call out, so I will go back to my editor, and we'll go to the schedule page. In V5, we have these things, or in V4, we have these things called modals, where we can go ahead and pass in this thing called presenting element. Now, in iOS 13, we have these different kind of interactions where the back view that you are calling to present should kind of animate down and should create some depth and layers inside of your application. We've gone through and supported this by using a presenting element, but what it also allows you to do is to be able to swipe to close that, that modal. So we've created a simple option, swipe to close, true. We can go back, let this reload. And up here, we just have that built in, and none of this is actually things that you had to wire up. Now, what's great is that the API for these animations and these gestures are all kind of standardized and exported out from our package. So if you had an app that needed custom gesture support, or if you want to write your own kind of component, I'm going to stick with the iOS theme. If you've ever used their music player, it has this really nice bar down at the bottom where you can say, here's now playing, swipe up, it'll go through and show you more details, set the volume, next, forward, or forward and back, play and pause. You can have all that built right in. So we'll just close that, continue on, and look at some of the other things that we have going on here. Oh, this totally ruins it. Okay, we'll ignore that. So with this V5, we've kind of just focused a lot on the style and the design updates about it. And if we can look at the dark mode aspects of it, we can see what's going on around here. Now, aside from all of these different colors that we have declared in here, which, to be honest, you don't need to know too much about. It's just setting up different colors that we could show off. What we have here is this dark theme. Now, dark theme itself depends on one media query to toggle that for you. Now, I would say against better judgment, we've included a different, in this example, we've included a different Zone.js listener for Windows Match Media. What we have here is just this entire setup to say, hey, is the match media, does the window say, it does prefer color scheme dark, evaluate to true? If so, emit this event, and we can change the color scheme dynamically. But the actual colors to do that, if we look at dark iOS, and let's zoom out a little bit just to see what we got. "32 lines. And that's completely retheming the app to look well on dark mode for iOS. Android has something slightly different, just because each of these platforms have their own little quirks, and Material Design says this is what dark mode should look like. But nothing, I would say, too far out there. So being able to completely redesign and completely theme the app is just built in, and when you start a project with V5, this is something that you will get out of the box. So we can guide you on that right path as soon as you start working with us. So I'm going to go back to the slides for a little bit. Now, we didn't go over too much of how to build apps with Ionic. It's because there is a great video that I posted on the Ionic YouTube account called the Ionic Crash Course. If you want to actually get going and start building apps, I edited it. I did like an actual professional good job on it. My bosses were happy. Please leave me a +1, like and comment and subscribe. But the kind of point is that if you're using Ionic now, or if you are interested in using Ionic, no, I wasn't talking to you, Siri. You can get started and jump right in and know that even though I'm on V4, V5 is a very gentle upgrade. I'm coining this new term for this major release. It's a minor major change. For some Semver jokes. Basically, the changes that we had wanted to make, we've already made, and just added deprecation warnings. Now we can just be like, all right, we've kept these around for like 5 minor releases, and however many patch releases that exist in there. Let's actually pull the plug and just like remove them from the code base. That way, we feel like we've given people enough time. V5 is the right moment to do this. And less new stuff, but just refining what we already had. And I know this is going to be on YouTube later, but if you can all keep a secret, we're going to release V5 tomorrow. So any of the worries and kind of stuff about that, don't worry about it. Do not tweet this out. My bosses will be very upset. Please don't. V5 will be released tomorrow. Hopefully, fingers crossed, nothing bad happens, and you will get all the latest and greatest updates, all the cool things that I kind of went over today, and then IB support, which I think is the most important thing. I didn't mention it, but this entire demo, if I go to the right tab, is all built using Angular 9 with Ivy enabled, and it just works. So it just works trademark. So if you have any questions, I'd love to take them now. Otherwise, thank you.